This year, as far as I understand, this continues to be dedicated in memory of Elisheva Batsima, Zichronah Livracha. I'm also going to add today, this is my father's yahrzeit, my father's 11th yahrzeit. His name was David Ben Gershon, Zichronah Livracha. I'll just say a word. My father was a very, very humble individual, a balabos who worked, but he was also very knowledgeable, did not have the opportunity in his formative years to sit and study in the yeshiva for any length of time, although he did have the opportunity to hear our great Rabbi Rav Soloveitchik sporadically throughout the years. He was what we know known as a Yodea Sefer. He knew things in halacha very, very well. But when they came in Aliyah in 1993, my parents came, so my father joined the kollel of Max Weil, Olav Shalom, had a kollel. It was here for quite a few years, and there was a regular 3 times a week, a shir where they studied b'chavruta, and there was a magid shir, and then afterwards there was a rotating guest magid shir, and I had a zchut of being one of them. So my father put in 22 years of learning, and he said it was making up lost time. And they covered quite a few mesichtot, as my wife can testify, because she was using my father's gemaras for the Daf Yomi, and there were quite a few, just finishing Masechet Horiot, which was the last gemara that my father had in the set of the Steinsaltz gemaras. My parents were able to go to concerts and tiyulim and whatnot. They just had 22 years of Gan Eden here, and out of nowhere on a Friday, my father was gone, and that was it. It just mamash mita benishika, and at age 88. So he is sorely missed in the family, and so I dedicate the shir. It was a big zchut that my parents were able to come to many of the shiurim that I was giving at the OU for so many years. This morning we're going to deal with the poem that's included in the Ashkenaz Machzor. Even if you have a Nusach Svard, it's there. I'm not talking about Eidot HaMizrach. Ashkenazim say the poem immediately after the Chazan begins the Chazarat HaShatz of Musaf. So we have a lot of poetry in the Machzor, an awful lot of poetry. Some of the shuls have all kinds of oddball rules, which poems we say and which we don't say. Usually it has to do if it's small print, we don't say. That's totally arbitrary. And furthermore, there are times where the poem itself is broken down into 3 different component parts. One is Avraham, one is Yitzchak, and one is Yaakov. Now, in the first bracha of Shmon Esrei, it's Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, our forefathers, the God of our forefathers, and then it splits, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, v'Elokei Yaakov. Now, we just said Avotenu, so why do we have to spell out Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov? And if you're going to say Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, why do you have to say Avotenu? Well, we know that. There seems to be something extra here. But don't blame the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. It's lifted out of a pasuk in Shmot, Perek Gimel, where it says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu that he can introduce God to Am Yisrael as Elokei Avotechem, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. So there are different understandings, so why that's repeated. And the way our Rebbe, the Rav Zichron Lebracha, understood it is that on the one hand, the Avot is a collective whole. There is a thing called Avotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and each one is, Avraham receives the not just the blessing, but also the promise, the assurance of Eretz Yisrael. That's what's called the Haftacha. We say Eretz Yisrael Muftachat. He is promised from the days of Avraham Avinu. It's not yet sanctified. Eretz Yisrael becomes sanctified first in the days of Yehoshua, in the entry of Am Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. But the promise goes back to Parshat Lech Lecha, Me'artzecha, and so on. And that's Avraham, who passes this down to Yitzchak, who passes it down to Yaakov, and that becomes the collective whole of Avotenu. But then there's also the idea that each one of the Avot had a particular spiritual neural pathway to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that differed. Yitzchak's way to HaKadosh Baruch Hu differed from his father, and Yaakov differed from his father and his grandfather. And that teaches us a tremendous lesson, that we're not robots. We are individual people. We have our own minds. We have our own neshamas. We have our own spiritual dimension. And therefore, although there is a composite whole of guidelines, which are called Torah mitzvot, to how to approach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the individual way of getting there can differ. And it's completely legitimate. You don't have to arrive at HaKadosh Baruch Hu the same way your father and grandfather. As a matter of fact, you won't, because you're different. Everybody's different. So there's a Gemara that says in the end of Masechet Brachot, Kishem she'ein partzufeihem domot, just as our facial complexion are different, no two human beings look alike, even identical twins. The mother knows, where the twitch in the nose is, that's different from one twin to the other, even in identical twins. So too, kach ein deot domot, the opinions are not alike, which means that if there are, some 12, 13 million Jews in the world today, so the 12, 13 million ways of how to approach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So obviously, within that large number, you can break it down into communities and groupings and so on. But the method of Avodat Hashem, of Hasidim, differs than the Misnagdim. That we know that. That's like big story. And so on. And within the Hasidic world, somebody who's a Chassid Chabad, his way to HaKadosh Baruch Hu differs very much than somebody who's a Chassid from Ger. So even though they're both Hasidim, it's not just that they have different rebbes, but they're different modes of Avodat Hashem. And within the framework of those who are not Hasidim, as you know very well, there are different ways of getting and approaching HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's why the Torah teaches us up front, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows who we are, but we are taking the fact that there is a precedent from Avotenu that no matter who I may be, and very different from the person standing next to me in shul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be able to tune in. And that's why we say, V'zocher chazdei avot. We ask God to remember chazdei avot. Umevi goel l'vnei v'neihem. Who are the v'nei v'neihem? We are the v'nei v'neihem. So that's how we all connect HaKadosh Baruch Hu, beginning Shmon Esrei. You can't budge in Shmon Esrei if you don't have that clear in the minds. That's why the halacha is of great interest. It says, there's a whole question about kavanah. So kavanah means the awareness that you're standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It means that you are aware of the content of the brachot. So the Gemara tells us that, of course, you should have kavanah for the whole Shmon Esrei. That's clear. But if you don't, and many of us somehow find ourselves mind floating during Shmon Esrei, so it says, as long as you had kavanah in the first bracha, by bracha vavot, because the bracha vavot is so critical, because it really puts you into the right mindset of what the Shmon Esrei is what's going to happen in the Shmon Esrei. So we have this first initial bracha. So during the week, right, the Shliach Tzibur pretty much gobbles it up, and the Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv, the weekday davening. But when it comes to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we take it slow. I remember my father used to say in Yom Kippur, when the Chazan was davening very slowly, so sometimes people would be agitated, and my father would say, "Wie läuft man? Where are we running?" He used to say it all the time, "Wie läuft man?" When you have to get upset, let him. Yom Kippur you can gargle out as long as you got all day. Mamash. Well, so the break between Musaf and Yom Kippur and Mincha will be shorter. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as a break. There's no such. Right, you just keep going. You keep going. And the Rabbi explained this of Ya'ale tachnunenu me'erev, v'yavo shavatenu mi-boker, v'yera'eh rinunenu ad erev. Now this is said right in Ma'ariv of Yom Kippur, after the Shmon Esrei, the night of Kol Nidrei. So what is this me'erev, boker, erev? It's the pasuk me'erev ad erev tishbestu shabbatchem from Vayikra Kav Gimel. And it means, the Rav said, that it's a run-on tefillah. Every davening, it's not like in the weekday. You daven Ma'ariv, fine, finish, you went left shul. You daven Shachris, you left shul. Daven Mincha, you left shul. No. Yom Kippur, it's just a run-on tefillah. It's Ya'ale tachnunenu me'erev v'yavo shavatenu mi-boker v'yera'eh rinunenu ad erev. And do you know that there were people who never left shul at night of Yom Kippur? You may remember this. You may have heard this from your grandfathers. They never left shul after Ma'ariv of Kol Nidrei. They would say Tillim the whole night, and they would just be up and then continue. And the Rav explained that the saying of Aleinu l'shabeach at the end of any tefillah is actually a method of how we part with standing before the presence of God, the Shekhinah. There has to be a proper way of leaving. You can't just slam the siddur shut and run out. So Aleinu l'shabeach is an elegant way of how we part with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So do you ever notice that on Shabbat there is no Aleinu after Shachris? Why? Because we're not running out. There's Musaf. We're there. We're still there. So whether it's Shachris of Yom Tov or Rosh Chodesh, there's no Aleinu after Shachris. But on Yom Kippur, there's no Aleinu neither after Shachris, nor after Musaf, nor after Mincha, nor after Nila, because you're going right into Ma'ariv of Motzei Yom Kippur. Right? Nobody says Aleinu Shabbat. The Aleinu is already Motzei Yom Kippur. And of course, some people have asked the question, why do we say V'hu Rachum Yichaper Avon V'lo Yashchit by Ma'ariv Motzei Yom Kippur? My gosh, you said 5 Tefillot Yom Kippur. You're hoping for the best. At least for 5 minutes, we shouldn't have any Averis. What's V'hu Rachum Yichaper Avon? What is that all about? The answer is, you ever see the way people daven Ma'ariv Motzei Yom Kippur? That's the first Avera. That's already foot on the gas pedal and so on. Yeah.
Who said people say that right after Yom Kippur, because they say the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, that's their first lie of the year.
Let me tell you, that was the story of a Seder in Borough Park. You know, people sitting on the plush carpeting and the chandeliers and everything, and they were singing with gusto at the end of the Seder, the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, and the wife was crying, "Oh, never, we're going to have to leave this beautiful house, and everything is so wonderful here and everything." And the husband says, "Don't worry, it's only a song." Nebuch, I cry when I say this. Yeah, Baksha.
When I was growing up, watching my grandmother, my mother, we said that at the end of Nila, everyone, the women are running out.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, my mother's dead.
Right. So we do say Aleinu l'shabeach after Ma'ariv of Kol Nidre, and that's because, in fact, we do leave shul. So that's why there is a Ma'ariv. But if somebody really was going to stay in shul and continue saying Tillim and so on, there could be a reason not to say Aleinu even after Ma'ariv. There was a gentleman in my shul who said, of course, we finish Musaf on Yom Kippur at about 1:30, 2 o'clock, and then people come back at 3:30 for Mincha, so maybe we should say Aleinu after Musaf. You know, so I said, you're right, and we're not doing it. So you're absolutely right, but we're not doing it because I'm not going to be the first one to introduce something like that. You know, that has to come from a higher authority, and it's not me. So, but the Rabbi also explained, if you talk about Yekeshuls from Frankfurt, they used to daven Mincha Ma'ariv in the weekday back to back. Mincha Ma'ariv, so there was no Aleinu after Mincha. For that very reason. Because if you're davening another davening immediately after finishing the previous davening, there's no Aleinu Shabeach. So some people have given the nickname Aleinu Shabeach. You know, people say it with one foot out the door. They call it Tfilat HaDerech. You know, it says but Aleinu.
We didn't say between Mincha and Kabbalah Shabbat.
For the same reason. For the same reason, because you're there in shul immediately after Mincha, you're saying Kabbalah Shabbat and Ma'ariv, right? For the same reason. So anyway, the Chazan says the first bracha, and then he goes into poetry. And the poetry, right before what we have on the page, is standard for all the times that a Shliach Tzibur is going to begin the poetry, any poetry. Misod Chachamim Unevonim. Right? It's not on the page. Misod Chachamim Unevonim Umilemed Dad Mivinim Eftach Pi B'Tfilah B'Tachnunim. Yes, it's a preamble. Yes, Kadosh Baruch Hu, you know, help me open my mouth properly and so on. It's almost a restatement of Hashem Sfatay Tiftach Ufi Yagid Tilatecha, which is a pasuk asking Kadosh Baruch Hu to help me say the right things. And then we get into the poem. So right before we start the poem, this is the very big issue of, are we allowed to include things in the Shemona Esrei? This is an inclusion. This is not part of the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. The poem, Upad Me'az L'Shefet Hayom, was written by Rabbi Elazar Kalir, and although there's some discussion as to what era he lived in, the overwhelming majority state that he's from the 7th century in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Elazar Kalir, Okay, so that puts it about 1500 years ago. Beseder. But that's after the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah of 2,500 years ago. And they authored the Shemona Esrei. The Tfilot are there. The Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah already has the program of what the Tefillah of Rosh Hashanah is going to look like. Beseder. But it doesn't include these medieval poetry that's crept into the Machzer. Are you allowed to say it? So let's just begin with the issue of inclusions. There are two types of inclusions in Shemona Esrei. One is an inclusion that's mentioned by the Gemara, which means our Chachamim, and they are indispensable. Indispensable. So one of them has to do with the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, that in the third bracha, V'ata Kadosh, we don't end with Hakel HaKadosh, but we end with HaMelech HaKadosh. Baruch Atah Hashem Melech HaKadosh. If somebody in the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah says Hakel HaKadosh, it's tantamount to have not davened. It's not that that bracha was faulty. The whole Shemona Esrei is faulty, and you just have to daven again. It's amazing. But then there are some types of add-ons that are only what's called lechatchila. We should do it because the day is special. We should give some mentioning to it. But if you didn't say it, it's not going to kill the Shemona Esrei. The examples would be Al Anisim on Chanukah and Purim. So we add Al Anisim, Chanukah and Purim. The Gemara even refers to this, but it's not something that's critical. It's just a special halacha of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. Every day you have to give some special attention. If the day was special, fine. But if you didn't, it's not the end of the world. But HaMelech HaKadosh is indispensable for Shemona Esrei. And with regard to Ya'aleh V'yavo on Yom Tov, it's indispensable. And with regard to Ya'aleh V'yavo on Rosh Chodesh, it's indispensable just for Shachris and Mincha, but not for Ma'ariv. If you forgot Ya'aleh V'yavo by Ma'ariv on Leil Rosh Chodesh, you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei. Now, the Rav in 1958, I was not at the Shir, okay? I was not at the Shir in 1958, but the Rav spoke about the issue that somehow glossed into the question of Ya'aleh V'yavo by Ma'ariv, and it has to do with the Gemara that tells us that Beit Din never sanctified the moon at night. There was never an official Rosh Chodesh proclamation at night because Beit Din, that accepted witnesses who saw the visual sighting of the moon, that Beit Din would not be in session until the morning. And therefore, at nighttime, you may know it as the calendar date. You know that it's going to be Rosh Chodesh, but it's not yet proclaimed Rosh Chodesh until the morning. And therefore, the nighttime of Rosh Chodesh never carried with it the sanctity of Rosh Chodesh. And that's why if we say the Ya'aleh V'yavo, because the calendar date has already changed, but if you missed it, and it's not the end of the world. But in the morning, for Shacharit, and the afternoon in Mincha, it's indispensable, the Ya'aleh V'yavo. So it's interesting to study the add-ons. What about the add-ons for Yomim Noraim? Zochreinu L'chaim, and Micha Mocha, and Chtov L'chaim Tovim, and B'Sefer Chaim, B'Sefer Chaim, we say at the end. Those are 4 add-ons that we say. So there's another add-on that I did not mention, HaMelech HaMishpat. That's just for weekday davening, but we have the bracha of Hashiva Shofteinu Kol Shana. So normally we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. And in the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, on the weekdays, we say HaMelech HaMishpat. And if you forget that, so you'll look at the Rinat Yisrael Siddur, and all the Siddurim says, you don't have to repeat it. If you overshot and you said the standard Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, go right on. You don't have to repeat anything. The Rambam says you do have to repeat. So the Sfardim are a little bit more strict about HaMelech HaMishpat. Why? A lot of people are not aware of this. They're just not aware of it. If you look at source number 4, source number 4, it says, Kol Hashanah Kula Chotem Bebracha Shlishit Hakel HaKadosh. Throughout the year, in the third bracha of V'ata Kadosh, we end with Hakel HaKadosh. Uberkat Ashtei Asrei, and in the 11th bracha, we end with Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Ubaseret hayamim shemirosh Hashanah ad motzei Yom Kippurim, but Aseret Yemei Teshuvah choten b'shlishit. In the third bracha we conclude HaMelech HaKadosh. Ubaseret Yemei Teshuvah we conclude HaMelech HaMishpat. That's very, very much categorical there. There's only one thing. The Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, who goes lenient on the HaMelech HaMishpat for Ashkenazim, says, because we mentioned the word melech anyway throughout the year. We say melech ohev tzedakah mishpat. All right, we should have said hamelech hamishpat. But the word melech snuck in the standard ending of the whole year. So it's not a disaster if you didn't say hamelech hamishpat. Now, if you just look at the printed, what I have here, the Rambam also has melech on the first line at the end. Melech ohev tzedakah mishpat. Okay, so this is a whole chapter in my book, and that is that the printed Rambams in Europe many times carried by accident Nusach Ashkenaz. Rambam never wrote this. We have the Rambam's handwriting on this, his autograph. The Rambam's end of that third bracha is Ohev Tzedakah Umishpat. That's how he ended the bracha of Yeshiva Shofenu. Baruch Atah Hashem, Ohev Tzedakah Umishpat. The word Melech wasn't there. So therefore, according to the Rambam, if you didn't say Hamelech HaMishpat, it's just like you didn't say Hamelech HaKadosh. The same halacha kicks in, you have to repeat Shmoneh Esrei if you didn't say Hamelech HaMishpat. So how come in the print it says here, Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat? What happened was, and I don't want to get into a lengthy, but just on 1 foot, as we say, once upon a time, everything was manuscript. And when they went over to print, so it wasn't digitalized 500 years ago. Like today, all you do is sit on your computer and you type out what you want to be printed and you push the word print and it goes to the printer and it's all digitalized. They had to set every letter. It was very painstaking. Every letter had to be. So the people who were the typesetters were looking at the manuscript and then putting in the blocks, looking in the manuscript, putting in the block. When they got, and the big printing houses were in Europe. Right, there was in Vienna and other places. There were in Vilna. There were great printing houses in Europe of Sifrei Kodesh. When the printers saw the Rambam was talking about a bracha utfilah, they felt they were able to sigh with relief. They didn't have to look at every word because they also davened. They knew the tefillot by heart. So what did they do? They typeset what they remember from their own davening, and then all of a sudden these prints made it into the standard editions of the Rambam with Ashkenazi Nusach in many of the brachot. That's what happened. I have a whole chapter on this. It happened often. It's not just one slip. We're talking about a phenomenon that happened. And today it can be rectified because of availability of manuscripts of the Rambam himself, so we know exactly what the Rambam really wrote. You can go to Yemenite texts that weren't impacted by the printers of Europe. It's as simple as that. And their manuscripts were more accurate, much more accurate than some of those manuscripts that made it to Europe. So the reason that Ashkenazim are lenient with Hamelech HaMishpat because we say Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, and the reason the Rambam insisted you have to say Hamelech HaMishpat because his ending throughout the year was Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat. Okay, but now we can take a look at the next halacha, source number 4. Yesh mekomot shenagu lahosif be'asara yamim elu bebracha rishona zachrenu l'chayim. There's a custom. There's a pretty widespread custom that we add Zachrenu l'chaim in the end of the first bracha, u'bishneya in the second bracha, v'ata gibor v'yen michamocha avarachamim, and in the third bracha, in the brachat modim, before v'chol l'chaim duchat sela, u'v'odah we say zchor rachamecha, we say uchtov l'chaim tovim, he has the Musaf, and in the last bracha b'sefer chayim. V'yesh mekomot shenargu losif basara yamim elu bebracha shlishit, ובכן תן פחדך, ובכן תן כבוד, אבל בראש השנה ויום כיפור, מנהג פשוט ולהוסיף בשלישית, ובכן פחדך. The phrase מנהג פשוט means widespread custom. It was a widespread custom, and we have this today, that only on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we expand the bracha Vata Kadosh to include Uv'chein tein pachtacha Shem Elokeinu kol maasecha, Uv'chein tein kavod, Uv'chein tzadikim, and so on, that whole elongated bracha. But the Rambam says there were some communities who actually expanded the Vata Kadosh for the entire duration of the Aseret Temei Tshuva. Fine, that's not our minhag. Now, there was a little letter, if you look on the first line of that, what I just read, Yutet, there was a letter in brackets, Kaf. And that brings me down to source number 5. Don't worry, I didn't forget about the poem. Hagaot Maimoniot. This is important. Hagaot Maimoniot. Who is the author of the Hagaot Maimoniot? His name was Rabbi HaKohen Hashem Yikom Damo. In 1298, there was a pogrom in Ashkenaz, which is Germany and a little bit northern France. It was called the Rindfleisch pogrom. I learned about this from some of my colleagues when I was in Boston 3 years ago. But one of the Gedolei Yisrael who was murdered was Rabbi Meir HaKohen, along with his Rebbe, but his Rebbe is a real story, and that's the Maharam Rutenberg, Moreno of Meir ben Baruch, who dies in prison. They wanted to ransom him, and he gave a psak halacha not to be ransomed because he said it's just going to encourage more hostage taking, and this resonates with the situation today. And he dies in prison, and I believe it was 11 years later that they allowed the bones to be retrieved by the Jewish community and be buried. So he's murdered, and his prime student, Rabbi Meir HaKohen, the author of the Hagot Maimoniot. What does the Hagot Maimoniot do? He takes the Mishneh Torah of the Rambam, the Sfardi, and he makes it Ashkenazi friendly. Because the Rambam is a Sfardi posek. He does exactly what several years later Rav Moshe Isserles is going to do to Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosef Karo is a Sfardi. And in order to make the Shulchan Aruch Ashkenazi friendly, Rav Moshe Isserles writes, but we do it differently. We do this, we don't do that, and so on. And the printers were very, very kind. They printed Rabbi Yosef Karo in bold letters, and they printed Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, in Rashi print. So whenever you look at a Shulchan Aruch, it's a ping pong match, and you're going from Krakow to Tzfat, Tzfat to Krakow, Krakow to Tzfat, and so on. Fine. That's late 16th century. But in the 14th century, you have Rabbi Meir HaKohen doing the same thing for the Rambam, Mishneh Torah. And he calls it Hagaot Maimoniot. And he also expands with all different types of customs. So here, the Rambam said what he said, and the Hagaot Maimoniot kicks in, and he says, Bahag, that's Baal Halachot Gedolot, that's also from 7th century in the days of the Geonim, wrote, Katav, the Ika Isura mid the Rabbanan Shanoim Kain. There's a rabbinic prohibition from doing something like that. Why? Because if you say Zechreinu l'chayim, Melech hafetz b'chayim, v'katveinu b'sefer chayim, that's a petition. You're asking God for something. In the first 3 brachot of Shemon Esrei and the last 3 brachot of Shemon Esrei, we are not doing any asking. That you do in the middle. The first 3 is Shevach, praise of God. The last 3 are Hodaya, which is thanksgiving to God. The Tachnunim part, the Bakashot part, the request, that's the core, that's the nucleus, okay. But it's surrounded by a sandwich of Shevach and Hodaya. So how can we have these add-ons in the first 2 brachot and the last 2 brachot in areas of Shemon Esrei we're not allowed to ask anything? And here we're asking. So he says this looks like a rabbinic prohibition from asking things in the first 3 and the last 3. It says, Lo yish al tzrachav, don't request your needs, begimel rishonot in the first 3, and in the last 3. Ubeperek Yudchet of Masechet Sofrim, Tanya, it says, Ein maskirim zechreinu. In other words, this is also a Gaonic work. Masechet Sofrim is not part of the Gemara, 6th, 7th century, and apparently the minhag, the custom was known about this zechreinu. It's not mentioned in the Gemara at all, and some of the Gaonim said, don't do it. It's wrong to add Zechreinu, because you're now asking for something in the first bracha of Shemon Esrei, and that is not proper. And by the way, when we say Mashiv Uruch Mordei Geshem in the second bracha, that is categorically not a request, because the request for rain is in Barech Aleinu after the 7th of Cheshvan here in Eretz Israel, where we say Talumata Levracha. That's when we're asking for rain. He should give us the rain properly in its time, and so on. But Mashiv Ruach is simply, quote unquote, buttering up God. He's the rain giver. So before you ask God to give rain, make sure you know that the rain giver isn't the weatherman on Reshet Bet. Okay? It's a Kadosh Baruch Hu, who he's the one who gives rain. So that's why Rabbi Eliezer had no problems saying Mashiv Ruach Mordei Geshem already from the first day of Sukkot. First day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yeshua said, you know, if you're going to remind God on the first day of Sukkot that He's the rain giver, without even asking for rain, Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to say, Nachon, okay, let's open the faucet. We don't want it to rain on Sukkot. The last thing in the world you want it to do on Sukkot is to rain. You're going to be driven out of the Sukkot. So, you know, hold your tongue until Shmini Atzeret, when there's no longer a mitzvah of eating in the sukkah, and then you can have geshem. You can stop Mashav Baruch Geshem. But Rabbi Yeshua, who says say Mashav Baruch on the 8th day of the Yom Tov, agrees wholeheartedly that Mashav Baruch is not a tefillah. It's not a real tefillah. Okay, so that's why you're allowed to say it in the second bracha. So here you have this prohibition from the Masechet Sofrim not to say the Zachrenu at all. But it says, but the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur may be, it says, Ella b'shnei yamim shel Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim, af elu b'koshi hitiru. Reluctantly, they allowed it to pass. Reluctantly, to say Zachrenu l'chaim and Mi Kamocha and Duchtov l'chaim and B'Sefer Chaim on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Reluctantly. Okay? So you see, this is an issue. Ve'ein lanu ela min hag rabotenu v'kadmonenu aleim shalom, says the Hagot Ma'amanuyot, we have the custom of our great predecessors. Omnam im ta'a v'shachach v'lo amar zachrenu o michomocha o chtov l'chayim o b'sefer chayim nireh mikan de'ein machzirim oto. It's clear that if you forgot to say zachrenu and any of the others, you don't repeat, because there were those who said don't say it in the first place. So if you didn't say it by accident, let it be. That's all. V'chein katav Rabbeinu Tam de'ein machzirim oton dvarim. So Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, knows about saying zachrenu l'chayim, and he also says, don't repeat it if you forgot to say it. Okay. Beseda. And then, because it's never mentioned explicitly anywhere. And then he quotes a few others, Tosfot Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, who says, Da'al elu ein machzirim de'ein shayach kan mishaneh mimatbeach chachamim. This is the reason I brought this. What does it mean, mishaneh mimatbeach chachamim? Changing the coined expressions of our Anshe Knesset Gdolah. They coined the phrases, they coined the bracha, which they minted into a nusach. And it is forbidden for us to deviate from the absolute wording of our chachamim. That's called kol ha-meshaneh mimatbeach shetavu chachamim b'brachot to'eh. If you deviate from the precise language of our chachamim, you are in error. But now what's being pointed out, that an add-on is not called mishaneh mimatbeach. Mishaneh mimatbeach, changing from the coined phrase, if you take the bracha itself and you alter the text, that would be mishaneh matbeach. But if you throw in a few things, that is not called mishaneh matbeach. And on that basis, not only did they allow the Zachrenu l'chaim to enter, but they allowed other poetry to enter. Now, the one who really, really was against the poetry entering was the Vilna Gaon. He said it was one big hefsek, one big interruption in the davening, in the Chazor Sashatz, and so on. And down the block, not far from here, Shari Chesed, in the Beit Knesset Al Shem Hagra, where you have the Prushim, those who of the descendants of the students of the Vilna Gaon who came about 225 years ago. They start carrying minhag of the Vilna Gaon. They don't say these piyutim in the Chazor Sashatz. And now Rabbi the Rav, who grew up on minhag of the Vilna Gaon, and that became axiomatic even in the Volozhina Yeshiva, because the Volozhina Yeshiva was founded in 1803 by the prime student of the Vilna Gaon, Reb Chaim from Volozhin, and that became later the minhag of Brisk, was the Rav's great-grandfather, who was in Volozhin, then moves to become the Rav of Brisk. Brest-Litovsk was Brisk. We learned about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 11th grade world history, where one of the treaties that ended World War I. Nobody told us that when the Rebbe in the morning said Brisk, he was talking about what the history teacher was talking about, Brest-Litovsk. But Brest-Litovsk is two cities. It's like Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's like two cities, or Budapest, right? So you sometimes have two cities joined together, so it carries both names. So there's Brest and Litovsk. So in Yiddish, it was called Brisk. It was they just took those two names and they just rammed them together. So Brest-Litovsk was abbreviated as Brisk. So that's why you say today. You say the Brisker Rav and everything. Fine. So the Rav had all these minhagim from the Vilna Gaon, but he himself deviated according to his whims of what he thought was correct. And some of the poetry he actually restores into his machzor. The most famous was Unatana Tokef. I mean, that's poetry. And the Rav said, what is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening without Unatana Tokef? Now, that's coming from a brisker, a hardcore student of the Vilna Gaon, and that's like really a deviation, a major deviation. And it's a major hefsek, because the Shlich Tzibur is finished, Machayei Meitim, and he says, Uvachein lecha taleh kedusha, which normally means signals, now we're going to say kedusha, whether it's Keter Yidnu lecha or Naritzcha v'nakdishcha, and so on. And all of a sudden, no. Unatana Tokef, Kedushat Hayom, Kehu Hayom v'Norah. And you have the old Barosh Hashanah Ketevun of Yom Tzom Kippur Yechot Emun, Kama Yavrun, Kama Yibareun, Mi Yechye, Mi Yamut, Mi Bekitzo, Mi Lo Bekitzo, Mi B'mayim, Mi B'esh. I mean, it's a very, very jolting, sobering experience. And somehow or another, when I was growing up as a youngster, I used to be a youngster, we used to think that this is all for older people. And I discovered in life that it's not just for older people. Not at all, yeah.
Today at the Havurah, they do not say Hashanah Torah or Yom.
I never davened there. It would be interesting to know. I never davened there, but I do know that the piyutim they don't say. General, whether they, it could be that there was pressure to because people just can't handle Yom Neroim davening without Unatana Tokef. It is really a core, a really important part of the tefillah. Adam yesodom me'afar v'sofo le'afar v'nafsho yavi lachmo mashul kecheres hanishbar. Yeah.
There's a very tragic story behind this.
Okay, so there's a tragic story behind the Unatana Tokef of Rabbi Amnon. We all grew up on that, and guess what? It's fiction. Yeah, it could be that there were some authentic parts to the story, but Rabbi Amnon did not write the Unatana Tokef. There's a wonderful professor of Hebrew literature specializing in Jewish poetry, Shulamit Elitzur. Some of you may have heard the name. And she published an article several years ago. The Unatana Tokef was actually discovered in the Cairo Geniza. and it was found in an anthology of poems from the Eretz Yisrael Paitan. The poet name was Yanai, 6th century. So it's a 6th century Eretz Yisrael poem. And it's a phenomenal article. She proves it. She proves it unequivocally. It's possible that Rabbi Amnon had access to it, and in his dying moment, he asked people to say it. That's possible. So I'm not, take Rabbi Amnon out of the picture completely, but he is clearly not the author of the Unatana Tokef. Okay? So now the question is these inclusions. So Yavaksha.
Just it shows like the Gemara when it comes to every day down, they add the little things at the bottom for Shema Kolenu, Reva'enu, Hosabat Shemot.
So there you're allowed to add. That's not a change in, because that means personalizing your Shemon Esrei. You're clearly allowed to do that. And in Shema Kolenu, before Kiata Shemea Tfilat Kolpeh or Kiata Shemea Tfilat Amchai Rachamim, there's a wild card there. You can say whatever you want in any language. It's like there's a moment where it's all yours. You're on stage, here's the microphone, say whatever you want to God, and whatever's on your mind. You're allowed to do that.
It's
Yeah.
also in the Botany, in Shemon Esrei.
Correct.
Where I'm doing it personally, it's put my own.
Right, for the refuah, it's been personalized. The nusach was written, so you can personalize it. Shetzishlach before Shlema, yeah? Yeah. Because the Gemara says to do it. That's already authorized. That's an authorized change. So if you don't say a Melech HaKadosh in Aseret Mechuvah, you are Meshanem Mimatbeh Shetavu Chachamim. The nusach of the bracha of Ata Kadosh in Aseret Mechuvah ends with a Melech HaKadosh. So of course, if you were at the Shir in 1958, when the Rav spoke about this, he wanted to know if you forget on the first night of Rosh Hashanah in Ma'ariv to say a Melech HaKadosh. By accident, what's called the Shigra Delishna. Your mouth kept rolling as a weekday Shmoneh Esrei, Ata Kadosh, Yucha Kadosh. You didn't even notice that there's a V'chein Tein Pachtecha, V'chein Tein Kavod, and you just said, Bochat Hashem, Akel HaKadosh. Do you have to repeat it or not? And the Rav quoted a contemporary of the Chayei Adam, whose name was Rabbi Avram Danzig, a contemporary, and he suggested, because there's no Kiddush HaChodesh by nighttime, so just like you don't repeat Ya'aleh V'yovai for not saying Ya'aleh V'yovai for Ma'ariv on Rosh Chodesh throughout the year, you wouldn't have to repeat the Ma'ariv davening of Rosh Hashanah the first night, because it's not really Kedushat Rosh Chodesh. And if it's not Kedushat Rosh Chodesh, it's not really Kedushat Rosh Hashanah. So... And the Rav took them apart. The Rav spent 2 hours in the shir taking apart that view and challenging it. It says incorrect. Rosh Chodesh is one thing. The Kedusha of Rosh Hashanah is something else. And, in his characteristic way of splitting hairs and showing, that was the shir of 1958. Okay. It's in print, don't worry. Yeah. So let's look at the poem. Upat me'az l'shefet hayom. Upat from the word ephod. Ephod means a vest. Yefeh. So it's in the Chumash, a vest. It's in the Chumash with regard to the Kohen Gadol. He has a choshen and an ephod. Right? He's got this apron of sorts. So it's a vest. That's a better word. Vest. And in this case, it actually means the robes of a judge. Judges sit with a robe, right? The Kadosh Baruch Hu is getting all dressed up to sit in justice. He's putting on his robe. Upad me'az l'shefet hayom. What do you mean me'az? Well, who's me'az? From when? From when is the Kadosh Baruch Hu sitting? And now it's Rosh Hashanah. From last night? From last year? From 100 years ago? From when? The answer is from before creation. From before creation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu already kicked this Rosh Hashanah into motion. Do you remember what we say on Pesukah Zimra on Shabbat morning from Tillim? B'terem harim yuladu. Before the mountains were even created, Vatomer shuvu v'nei adam was a call for tshuva. 1 second, there's no world yet. There's no human being yet. Nobody sinned yet. There was no mitzvah, no sin. Yet, there's a phrase that we use in Hebrew, lakdim trufa lemakah, to have the remedy on the shelf before the illness kicks in. Right? Everything's going to be ready. It's going to be ready. Kadosh Baruch Hu already had this all prepared. I said this already in the context of Nachamu Nachamu Ami, the double-edged Nechama of Yeshayahu was the remedy on the shelf for what later, 110 years later, Yirmiyahu is going to have a double language of crying in Eicha, Bachot Tifkeh Balayla. So to negate the Bachot Tifkeh Balayla, we have a double-edged consolation. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. So Kadosh Baruch Hu knows about this. Lakdim Trufa Lemakah. To have the remedy ready on the shelf before the machla, before the illness kicks in. So here, before mankind is created, before mankind is given commands, and before mankind sins, there's already tshuva. It's already there. Upad me'az, from Briat Olam, l'shefet hayom, to judge on this day. This day is ayom v'norah, as we say it in Tana Tokev. It's you're shivering. Bichon maaseh kol yom. He's going to examine, right? Bichon. We all knew what a bechina was in school, a bechina, a test. Bechon, he's going to check out your maasim of every day. Now, there's a big difference. I remember the Rabbi explaining this piyut. He said, what a difference between hayom and kol yom. Hayom is the day. After Masechet Rosh Hashanah, you have Masechet Yoma, which in the yeshivas they called it Masechet Yuma. But it's actually Yoma Hagadol. So it's the great day. Yoma is Hayom Hagadol. It's Yom Hagadol. So this is Rosh Hashanah is Hayom today. It's Hayom Ta'amseinu, Hayom Tivarcheinu, Hayom Tigadleinu. It's Hayom. You're shivering when you think about Hayom. But what is he going to be talking about? Not today. He's talking about what we did a half a year ago. We did 4 months ago. We did 9 months ago. In the Kol Yom, in the everyday. B'chol Naseh Kol Yom. Gishat Yikumim Pinei Ayom. The Yikum is the created person. It means man. Mankind is going to approach the Ayom, the awesome. It's awesome.
Face of
Dinambo lefales lepidyon. Because we're going to be standing in judgment, but we're hoping that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to pave the way. Pilus means to pave the way for our redemption. Somehow or another, we're going to make it through. We're going to survive the din. But you're not sure, but you hope that you have a good chance. Why? Harishon Adam bo notzar. Yeah. Who is the first man created? Adam Harishon. Harishon Adam bo notzar. God created Adam. Vitziva. Is this a misprint? Chok. Should be chok. Should not chok. Should be chok. Vitziva chok. And he gave him a law. Velo notzar. And he didn't guard it, which means he blew it. Right? He had one mitzvah. What was the mitzvah? Kashrut. Kashrut. Right, it wasn't Yoredeya. Mikol eitz hagan ochol tochel. You can eat from all the fruits. Be'etz ha'asher b'toch hagan lo tochal mimenu. Ki b'yom acholcha mimenu mot tamut. The day you eat from it, you're finished. You're finished. Ze meilitz kehariv batzar chakakol lamishpat veladorot munsar. I'm going to read you the, remember the Birnbaum Machzor? People used to use this, right? He writes, God protected and saved him from distress, right? That's the phrase, Ze melitz behirhiv batzar. This judgment day he designed for all time. Chakakol lamishpat veladorot munsar. The reason the poet is writing this, he's talking about the relevance. Kadosh Baruch Hu does something with Adam Rishon that's going to help us out. Here is where the whole source of our confidence that we're going to make this through. Why? What did Adam do right after what he did wrong? The Torah doesn't tell us. The Torah doesn't tell us. Kadosh Baruch Hu throws him out of Gan Eden and then gives him a battle plan for life where Adam's going to live another 930 years. So he doesn't die on that day. He should have died. But instead of dying, he's going to go through a struggle, a life of struggle. So if you recall, in the laws of Beit Din, there are capital punishment offenses in the Torah, and then there are offenses which are punishable by malkot. So the Gemara says, malkot bimkom mita omedet, that the lashing is actually in place of execution. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, don't wear shatnez. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, don't cook meat and milk. You did it, you're finished. But Kadosh Baruch Hu said on many of the Avirot, you know what? We'll give you a few patches and you'll go on. That's chesed. Because if it's midat hadin, if it was absolute judgment, ki b'yom acholcha mimenu mot tamut, you're finished. So Kadosh Baruch Hu switches from midat hadin, which means Adam is finished, to Adam living another 930 years, but as a struggling experience. B'zeyat apecha tochalechem, you're going to have to work hard to get your bread, and so on. Won't be an easy life. It's going to be a challenging life. But he goes on. But you don't see Adam doing anything. So why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu make the flip? What does it? So the Paitan says, Ti'at chotzev givoot v'tzurim. Kadosh Baruch Hu planted something in the valleys and in the hills and the rocks. Yuldu bo meirosh tzurim. This is a reference to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now you know why this is here. It's in the bracha of Avot. Yes, there's going to be Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov. And that's going to be important. Kadosh Baruch Hu wants Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Because from Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov is going to sprout all of Klal Yisrael. All of us. We are the V'nei V'neihem of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. And you know what's going to happen if I mete out the judgment to Adam? Biyom ha'chocham mimenu mot hamut. No Avraham, no Yitzchak, no Yaakov, no OUisrael. And therefore, the salvaging moment for Adam Rishon is his future. If a Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to look 20 generations down the road, he's going to realize, you know what? It's worthwhile keeping Adam around. That's what does it. Now, in the bracha of Zichronot, look at source number 2.
Which one?
For source number 2.
So,
Ata zocher ma'aseh olam. It's the second of the special brachot. Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. So in each one carries with them 10 quotations, 3 from Chumash, 3 from Tehillim, which represents Ketuvim, 3 from Nevi'im, and then 1 more from the Chumash. And you have in the Malchiot, you have in the Zichronot, you have the Shofarot. Fine. So Ata zocher. So there's a preamble to all of them. Like in Malchiot, it's Alkein nekaved lecha Hashem Elokeinu. That's the beginning of Malchiot. Ki hamalchut shelcha hi ulolmei atimloch bechavod, kakatuv b'toratecha Hashem yimloch le'olam vayed. That's the first of the 3 brachot of the Chumash. And then it says v'ne'emar, another pasuk. And then it says v'ne'emar. The Chazonim like to sing that, right? Because they need a breath. V'ne'emar, v'ne'emar, v'ne'emar. All right, what is it? Speak up, like v'ne'emar, v'ne'emar. Okay. So then there's Ata Zocher, which is the preamble for the psukim of Zichronot, and you have Ata Nigleta Ba'anan Kvodecha, the scene of Har Sinai, which is the preamble for the Shofarot. So I remember my father, Shalom, again today's his yahrzeit, he would sit at home after the meal of Rosh Hashanah, and without a machzor, he would just start. Ata zoicher ma'aseh olam u'foiked kol yitzurei kedem lefanecha niklu kol talumot v'amoi nistorot shemi bereshit ki ein shikha lefnei chizei chevodecha v'yehi nistor mineged einecha. That's how we learned the Nusach. My father was never, ever about tefillah. Never. He knew the Nusach perfectly. We have people here from Teaneck who remember my brother saying this as a Zaychar every single year. You're crying already. Me too. Me too. Because it's not going to happen again. And we say, Ein nistar, nothing's, Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't forget anything. Ata zocheret kol ha'mif'al. You remember all of our activities. V'gam kol ha'yitzur lo necham. He hasn't forgotten anybody. Nobody's off the chart. Hakol galui v'yadua lefenecha Hashem Elokeinu. Everything is known. Sofeh umabit at sof kol hadorot. He takes a peek till the end of generations. That's zichronot. If I remember correctly, memory is the past. So if you want to say it, Kadosh Baruch Hu remembers everything I did. Got it. Kadosh Baruch Hu remembers everything we all did. I got it. But what relevance is there? Sofeh umabit at sof kol hadarot. That's not zichronot. Well, guess what? To a Kadosh Baruch Hu, that is zichronot also. The Kadosh Baruch Hu on Rosh Hashanah is remembering everything that's going to happen. You know why that's important? Because that's how we get bailed out. We get bailed out on Rosh Hashanah the same way Adam Rishon got bailed out. Because the Kadosh Baruch Hu looked 20 generations ahead and he saw Avraham Avinu. And he said, yeah, it's Kedai. We're going to keep him around. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu is looking at us. And he says, terrible generation. This is a generation. You can't make one proper decision, Let's end it right here. Stoim v'moira. And Kadosh Baruch Hu looking down the road, he says, you know what? These people still believe in Mashiach, not just the Lubavitchers. They still believe in Acharit Yomim. And if I end it all with this generation, we'll never get to Acharit Yomim. And that's why Zichronot ends with Shofarot. Vaya bayom hahu, yitaka b'shofar gadol, uvau ovdim beretz Ashur, v'nidachim beretz Mitzrayim, v'ishtachavu l'Hashem, v'har HaKodesh Yerushalayim. And that's why when we say zichronot, and I think I made just a vague reference to this last week. So when we finish zichronot, we say ki zocher kol hanishkachot atahu me'olam. You remember everything that's been forgotten. You remember it. Ve'ein shikecha lifnei chisei chevodecha. There's no forgetfulness. And I just want to add parenthetically, we have a mitzvah in the Torah, one of the 613. It's called shikecha. Forgetfulness. Boy, I'm very machmer. I fulfill it every day. You forget where you put your keys, you know? What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is if you have a bundle of grain on your field and you didn't bring it in, v'shachachta omer basadeh, leave it already for the poor people. This is the only mitzvah that even those who say you have to have kavanah, intention to fulfill the mitzvah, you can't fulfill shikha with kavanah. It's the only mitzvah. Because it's not like, hineni muchan zuman the kayim mitzvah say shikha shachachti. I forgot. That's not going to work. It is only a mitzvah of bidi avad. You did it. It's there. Now the Torah says, don't take it back. Just don't retrieve it. Just leave it there. So remember, one of our daughters, who now is no small Talmid Chacham, when she was in Kita Aleph, she comes back from Friday and said, I learned about the 3 mitzvahs of the field. I said, which are the 3 mitzvahs? She said, leket, peah, vashlishit shachachti. I forgot the 3rd one. That's exactly what happened. Did I get it right? I got the story right. She said, vashlishit shachachti. I forgot the 3rd one. I said, that's the mitzvah. Leket, shikecha, and peah. But Kadosh Baruch Hu ein shikecha lifnei chisei chavadecha. Va'akedat Yitzchak lizaro hayom barachamim tiskor. Usually interpreted, and the Akedah of Yitzchak, Kadosh Baruch Hu today on Rosh Hashanah will remember it. And the Rav Zechariah Bracha said that's not what the word hayom means. Hayom means today. We're asking Kadosh Baruch Hu to take into consideration our Mesirat Nefesh, our Akedot, our challenges. And boy, do we have some. We have many, day in and day out. And we were in a war situation right now, again. And Kadosh Baruch Hu should watch over each and every one of the Chayalim. Everybody should come home b'shalom. We should be able to accomplish what we have to accomplish, the Tovat Am Yisrael. V'akedat Yitzchak lizaro hayom. And Kadosh Baruch Hu should see that the Akedah story has not ended. Has not ended. Barachamim tiskor. And I believe I mentioned here more than once, I'll repeat it again. When the Chazan starts Musaf on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he starts Hineni He'ani Mimas. Hineni He'ani Mimas. Nirawash V'nivchawa Mipachad Yoshev Tilat Yisroel. What is Hineni? So I said Hineni is the collective Hineni of Avraham Avinu at the Akedah. Chazan represents all of us. If we don't say Hineni before start to daven, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time.
We don't say that.
The Chazan does it for us. He's the Shliach Tzibur. He says, Vavapi, he says, Sheni Kedai, V'hagun Lekach, Lachein, he asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kabel tfilati, kitfilat zakein v'ragil, skano mugudal, uvkana. He says, according to all the qualifications of the Shliach Tzibur for Yom Neroim, he says, I don't fit the bill, but please accept my tefillah anyway on behalf of those who sent me. And when I believe in the Chazan says, Hineni he'ani mimas, he's talking about Hineni. And I believe that we do have that pledge to our Kadosh Baruch Hu. And with that pledge, we're going to take it into our tefillah of Rosh Hashanah next week. And we're going to ask Kadosh Baruch Hu, he's got to have rachmanut on us, and to give us a Shnat Chaim v'Shalom. It should be a year of Psurot Tovot and Yeshuot v'Nechamot. Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to meet after Sukkot. I'm not responsible that every Wednesday down the road now is either Yom Tov or Erev Yom Tov or whatever. So, or Isru Chag for that matter. So we're going to meet a week after Sukkot. We should have a Chodesh Tishrei of Bemet Zman Simchatenu, and we should be able to come back Briim V'Shleimim and continue Mitzvah Hashem.